You do not need a better dream. You need a stronger hand. You do not need another week of thinking, another month of planning, another season of refining the image of what your success might look like in its most polished form. You need to begin. That is the sentence perfectionism hates, because perfectionism survives by keeping a man in love with preparation while quietly training him to fear action. It will let you imagine greatness for years, so long as greatness never has to pass through the awkward stage where your real level is exposed. It will let you talk about standards, quality, timing, readiness, and discipline, so long as none of those words force you into the workshop where skill is actually farmed through repetition, correction, and the humbling sight of your own unfinished hand. So let us start here with a truth too direct for perfectionism to decorate. Your life is not being held back because your standards are too high. It is being held back because you keep asking the first step to look like the final result. And as long as you do that, progress will remain delayed behind the polished gate of fear. That is what perfectionism often is. Fear with good manners. Fear in a clean suit. Fear that has learned how to sound intelligent enough to avoid being questioned. It says, I just want to do it right. I am waiting until it is strong enough. I need more clarity before I begin. I refuse to put out weak work. Fine. Sometimes those phrases are honest, but often they are only better dressed versions of one darker sentence. I do not want to be seen while I am still becoming. That sentence has buried more books than bad writing ever did, ruined more enterprises than poor markets ever did, and suffocated more callings than open opposition ever did. The man was not conquered by lack of vision. He was conquered by the shame of being a beginner. Now, hear this with seriousness. There is no great life in which the beginning looked as strong as the finished form. None. Every master was once rough. Every commanding voice once sounded uncertain. Every disciplined man once had habits that still broke under pressure. Every successful builder once started with smaller tools, weaker rhythm, less confidence, less precision, and less evidence than his later years would carry. That is not failure. That is sequence. But perfectionism hates sequence. It wants arrival without apprenticeship. It wants excellence without repetition. It wants dignity without exposure. It wants to cross the river without getting its feet wet in the plain and unimpressive waters of practice. And because life never grants such a passage, the perfectionist keeps circling the bank, calling his delay prudence while time quietly goes on without him. This is why the issue before you is not talent. It is relationship to process. There are men with enormous ability who remain strangely unfruitful because perfectionism made them allergic to visible imperfection. They are full of taste, full of ideas, full of standards, full of criticism, full of imagined brilliance, but the hand remains underused. The work remains thin, the pages remain unwritten. The offer remains unmade. The skill remains untested. The account remains weak. The routine remains theoretical. Why? Because the mind was too refined to tolerate the ordinary humiliation of first attempts. Such men often suffer terribly because they can see the quality they want, but they cannot bear the roughness required to get there. That suffering is unnecessary. It comes not from the dream itself, but from the refusal to let the dream pass through plain labor. You must break that refusal. Do not misunderstand me. I am not telling you to become careless. I am not telling you to celebrate mediocrity, excuse laziness, or lower your standards until anything weak and unfinished can be called progress. No, standards matter. Quality matters. Care matters. But standards must be servants of progress, not assassins of it. A true standard says, do the work, then refine it. Perfectionism says, do not begin until refinement is already visible. A true standard says, build honestly at your current level, then strengthen what is weak. Perfectionism says, if your current level is not impressive enough, hide it. One path creates skill. The other creates delay. One path leads through correction toward mastery. The other preserves image while robbing the future. You must learn to tell the difference, because many intelligent men spend years worshiping perfectionism as though it were excellence, while all the while it is starving their actual output. Now let us go to the deeper wound. Perfectionism is often tied to identity. A man imagines himself as capable, gifted, serious, perhaps even called to something weighty. Good. But then he begins treating every first attempt like a referendum on that identity. If the effort comes out rough, he feels not merely corrected, but exposed. If the work is immature, he feels not merely unfinished, but personally diminished. So he begins protecting the image of what he could become more carefully than the work that would actually make him become it. This is tragic. It is also common. The man does not need more inspiration. He needs less vanity. He needs the kind of humility that can stand in the workshop without demanding applause for simply having entered it. Humility is one of the great cures for perfectionism, because humility can survive the sight of rough work. It can survive the knowledge that the first draft is weak, the first attempt clumsy, the first season inconsistent, the first routine unstable. Pride cannot bear these things. Pride wants the first song to sound like the 100th performance. Pride wants the first year to look like the 10th. Pride wants to be called excellent while still living at the level of promise. But humility says, if this is where I truly am, then let me begin here. That is a powerful sentence. It is a sentence that reopens time. It returns a man to reality. It cuts through false nobility and says, I do not need to look finished in order to keep building. That kind of humility is not weakness. It is the beginning of honest force. A humble man can practice more because he is not protecting himself from every flaw. He can repeat more because he is not turning each rough effort into a wound to his identity. He can publish, speak, build, train, save, lead, and create with greater steadiness because he has accepted a severe but freeing truth. The work does not owe him immediate elegance. He owes the work fidelity. Once a man learns this, perfectionism begins losing its old authority. He stops asking the first version to carry the full dignity of the final one. He lets the first version be what it is supposed to be, material, something to work on, shape, cut, strengthen, and improve. And that is exactly what progress needs, material. A rough page can be revised. A blank page cannot. A simple plan can be tested. A perfect imaginary plan cannot. A weak speech can be improved. A speech that never leaves the throat cannot. A basic budget can be strengthened. A fantasy of financial excellence that never touches actual numbers cannot. This is why action is so important. Action produces material. Perfectionism keeps withholding material from the process and then complains that mastery never arrives. Of course, it does not arrive. Mastery requires something to strike, something to correct, something to refine. Reality must be allowed to enter the room. Friction must be allowed to speak. Consequence must be allowed to teach. That only happens once the work leaves the mind and enters the world. Now let us speak about the world, because the world is one of the great teachers perfectionism keeps trying to avoid. The world teaches what the imagination will not. It teaches where the idea is too weak, where the message is unclear, where the routine falls apart under pressure, where the hand still reaches for waste, where the timing is poor, where the structure is unstable, These are painful lessons, yes, but they are useful. A man becomes dangerous when he stops seeing them as insults and starts seeing them as instruction. He says, "Good. Now I know. Good. Now I have something real to strengthen. Good. Reality has corrected a fantasy before the fantasy ruined more of my time." This is maturity. This is how ordinary effort becomes uncommon over time. Not because the man never produces anything weak, but because weak things are no longer allowed to send him back into hiding. And hiding is one of perfectionism's most expensive habits. A man does one rough piece of work, sees how far it falls beneath his inner standard, and disappears. He says he needs to rethink, recalibrate, refine, recenter. Sometimes what he really needs is simpler and harsher: to return tomorrow, to do the next repetition, to let the next attempt be better because the first one existed, not to go into exile for 3 weeks because his pride was cut by the sight of his current level. Return is crucial. Men who become excellent are not always the most gifted at the start. They are often the men who return the fastest after disappointing themselves. They do not dramatize imperfection. They use it. They do not turn one weak performance into an identity. They turn it into data. This is why one of the deadliest forms of perfectionism is all or nothing thinking. The day is not ideal, so the whole plan is abandoned. The page is not strong, so the whole project is questioned. The week is not perfectly disciplined, so the month is handed over to drift. This is not excellence. It is fragility. A strong man can absorb an imperfect day without letting it rewrite the law of the whole season. He can absorb a weak attempt without making it mean the calling is false. He can say, "That was poor. Good. Now continue." This ability to continue is more valuable than many forms of talent. Talent may excite. Continuation builds. Talent may impress once. Continuation creates a life. Now look at what perfectionism does to time. It steals it without looking like a thief. It does not always say, "Waste the day." It says, "Use the day to get a little more ready." Then another day. Then another. Months pass. Years pass. The man remains deeply attached to the image of future excellence and strangely disconnected from actual present labor. He still believes in himself, perhaps, still has plans, still feels inwardly destined for something meaningful. But destiny is not honored by admiration alone. It is honored by obedience, by contact, by completion. If your days keep ending with better theories and no finished work, perfectionism is not protecting your future. It is eating it. This must be said because many people are in love with possibility. Possibility is intoxicating. It lets a man imagine greatness without carrying the ordinary burden of becoming. He can dream of the book, the business, the strength, the influence, the room, the legacy. Fine. But possibility by itself is cheap if it is not daily converted into structure. The perfectionist often mistakes the pleasure of possibility for progress. He feels something while planning, so he believes he has moved. He feels something while imagining the polished result, so he believes he has advanced. But emotion is not output. Vision is not completion. Taste is not craft. The work must be done, and done by a hand willing to look less than masterful while still under training. This is where discipline rescues a man from himself. Discipline says, show up, produce the page, keep the hour, finish the assignment. Do not leave the room until material exists. It does not ask whether the first version flatters your standards. It simply keeps the hand moving until the hand becomes stronger. This is one reason disciplined men often outperform more naturally gifted perfectionists. They are willing to accumulate repetitions. They do not demand that every day feel profound. They do not require emotional proof before labor. They let the law of repeated effort carry them farther than inspiration alone ever could. And because they repeat more, they improve more. Because they improve more, the output eventually gains weight. Then weaker observers call them talented, when much of what they are really seeing is the visible result of a man who stopped making perfection a condition for obedience. Now let us come to the heart of this revised opening. You do not need to feel fully prepared to begin. You do not need to feel fully worthy to contribute. You do not need your first result to look like the final standard. You do not need the whole road to be visible. What you need is enough humility to let the first effort be incomplete, enough courage to let reality answer it, enough discipline to return after correction, and enough seriousness to keep producing material that can be shaped into something stronger. That is how progress actually works. Not in one polished leap, but through a series of honest acts carried out under imperfect conditions by a man who finally decided that his ego would no longer be allowed to starve his future. So let this opening leave you with a command, not a suggestion. Stop negotiating with perfectionism as though it were your ally. It is not. It is a beautiful jailer. It will keep your standards high, your dreams vivid, your ideas clean, and your hands empty. Break with it. Begin before you feel elegant. Begin before the plan feels flawless. Begin while the work still sounds rough to your own ear. Begin while the beginning still embarrasses your pride. Then stay with it, because progress does not belong to the man who waited for the perfect opening. It belongs to the man who finally became brave enough to let an imperfect beginning live long enough to become something real. Now, once you understand that perfectionism is not protecting your future but postponing it, the next truth comes with even greater force. Perfectionism does not merely stop the beginning, it poisons the middle. Many men manage to force themselves into a first step. They write the first page, make the first attempt, begin the first discipline, speak the first uncertain word, launch the first rough version. Good. But then the middle arrives, and the middle is where pride suffers the most. The middle is where the work is no longer imaginary, yet not yet admirable. It is where the dream has touched reality, and reality has answered with roughness, inconsistency, and correction. That is the place where perfectionism returns with sharper teeth. It whispers, "You should already be better than this. You should already sound stronger. You should already be farther along. If this is still this rough, perhaps you are not meant for it." Many promising men are not killed by the difficulty of starting. They are killed by the humiliation of continuing while still unfinished. That humiliation is not your enemy. It is your training ground. You must settle this in your spirit. The middle is not proof that you chose the wrong road. It is proof that you have finally entered the road honestly enough for the road to begin changing you. Before that, you were dreaming. In the middle, you are being shaped. And being shaped is not pleasant to pride. Pride wants the work to confirm the image it already held of itself. But real work often does the opposite at first. It exposes weakness. It reveals inconsistency. It shows you the distance between taste and execution, between desire and discipline, between what you imagined yourself capable of and what your current habits can actually carry. That exposure is not a curse. It is one of the greatest gifts in all progress, because what is exposed can be strengthened, but what is hidden behind perfectionism keeps ruling from the dark. This is why the man who progresses is not the man who never sees his roughness. He is the man who can see it without running. He can look at his current level and say, "Good." Now I know the truth. Good. Now the work has something real to shape. Good. My ego may be wounded, but my future has just been given useful information. Such a man becomes very dangerous to mediocrity because he stops requiring the process to flatter him before he will stay in it. He keeps practicing, keeps building, keeps correcting, keeps finishing what his pride wanted to abandon. That is rare. And rarity is almost always rewarded. Now let us speak plainly about one of perfectionism's favorite weapons in the middle, comparison. Comparison turns an ordinary stage of development into a humiliating courtroom. It makes a man take his own rough drafts and place them beside another man's finished work. It makes him take his first years and judge them against another man's 10th. It makes him look at someone else's visible ease and forget the hidden repetitions that likely built it. Then he begins despising his own process. I should be there by now. I should look like that by now. I should sound like that by now. No, you should be where law has honestly brought you according to the obedience you have actually given. If that wounds your vanity, let it wound it. Better a wounded vanity than a wasted life. Comparison is especially cruel because it does not merely show you what you lack. It often makes you dishonor what you already possess. Your own gains begin looking small. Your own progress begins sounding weak. Your own direction begins feeling worthless because another man's visible result is louder. This is insanity. A man can be moving in the right direction and still talk himself into paralysis because he keeps measuring his unfinished stage against someone else's mature fruit. That is why one of the great disciplines in the middle is to stay with your own field. Measure your present work against your past work. Measure your present discipline against your former drift. Measure your current steadiness against your former chaos. This is how a sane man grows. The perfectionist often refuses this simpler measure because it does not feed his appetite for grand self-judgment. But grand self-judgment builds very little. Honest repetition builds much. Now let us go deeper into another poison perfectionism introduces: the refusal to let progress be gradual. A perfectionist often has no problem with dramatic improvement. What he cannot tolerate is layered improvement. He wants the rough edge gone now, not slowly softened. He wants confidence now, not built through repeated exposure. He wants financial order now, not established through months of smaller right choices. He wants mental calm now, not formed through repeated refusal of weak thoughts. But real growth is usually layered. One discipline strengthens before another. One leak closes while another is still being exposed. One pattern improves while another remains irritatingly stubborn. This can offend the man who wanted a cleaner story. But strong men stop demanding clean stories and start respecting strong processes. That respect matters because a gradual process still leads somewhere. In fact, gradual processes often lead to stronger places than sudden ones. Sudden change can excite. Gradual change can stabilize. Sudden change may alter appearance. Gradual change often alters identity. This is why you must stop using slowness as an accusation. Slowness is not always failure. Sometimes it is evidence that the thing being built is deep enough to last. Sometimes it is the sign that the roots are being made safe before the branches become visible. Perfectionism cannot appreciate that because it is too hungry for immediate confirmation. But the man who wants actual progress must learn how to honor the slower law. Now, there is something else you must understand about the middle. It often feels repetitive, and repetition insults the perfectionist mind. The perfectionist wants every effort to feel meaningful in a dramatic way. But repetition is plain. Repetition says, do it again. save again, practice again, show up again, correct again. It is not always emotionally satisfying. Yet repetition is exactly what turns a weak hand into a strong one. A man learns courage by repeated courageous acts, not by admiring courage. He learns skill by repeated practice, not by fantasizing about excellence. He learns discipline by repeated self-government, not by making one powerful vow and then disappearing for 10 days. If you despise repetition, you despise one of the greatest laws of mastery. And if you despise one of the greatest laws of mastery, then do not be surprised when mastery keeps avoiding your address. This is why you must become more willing to be ordinary on the road to becoming uncommon. That sentence wounds pride, but it frees the future. To become extraordinary later, you must often tolerate a long season of very ordinary-looking faithfulness. Ordinary writing days, ordinary workouts, ordinary savings habits, ordinary hours of study, ordinary attempts to speak better, think cleaner, respond more wisely, structure the day more honestly. None of this looks like legend in the beginning. It looks like consistency. Good. Consistency is what legends are built on. The perfectionist wants the legend without the consistency. He wants the speech without the years of speech, the body without the seasons of restraint, the wealth without the tedious months of wise accounting, the influence without the quiet years of becoming trustworthy. This is fantasy, and fantasy is a poor employer. Now, another way perfectionism poisons the middle is by making correction feel like condemnation. This is disastrous. If every flaw in your work feels like a verdict on your value, then you will soon fear the very feedback that could have made you better. You will either avoid exposure, resist instruction, or grow dramatic every time weakness is pointed out. None of these responses build strength. The stronger man learns a better relationship with correction. He says, correction is not humiliation. It is information. This flaw does not condemn me. It directs me. This weakness is not a final sentence. It is a map. Once you begin thinking that way, feedback becomes far less threatening. You stop protecting yourself from reality and start using reality to train the hand. This does not mean correction is always pleasant. It can sting. It should sting a little when you still care. But the sting must not become a reason to flee. It must become part of the cost of becoming excellent. Every serious craftsman, builder, teacher, writer, leader, and businessman has been corrected by reality 1,000 times. The difference is not that they escaped correction. The difference is that they did not keep treating correction like betrayal. They let it shape them. Perfectionists often keep mistaking the pain of being corrected for a sign that the work is not for them. But pain is often simply the proof that reality is finally working on the fantasy. Now let us address something extremely important. Perfectionism often causes men to restart too much. They do not continue. They restart. They abandon routines, plans, drafts, disciplines, budgets, and systems the moment the process feels contaminated by imperfection. Then they begin again with a fresh burst of zeal and a slightly revised ideal, only to repeat the same cycle once the new attempt also proves less elegant than imagined. This is wasteful. Restarting can feel productive because it gives the illusion of seriousness. But too much restarting is often just a more respectable form of quitting. The stronger man learns how to continue. Continue the budget after a bad week. Continue the project after a weak draft. Continue the discipline after a missed day. Continue the learning after a poor performance. This ability to continue is what eventually produces visible power. Not repeated emotional starts, but durable continuation. That is why you must begin thinking in terms of returning, not restarting. Return tomorrow. Return to the page. Return to the task. Return to the ledger. Return to the habit. Return to truth. Restarting often worships a fresh image. Returning honors a real process. Restarting says, let me begin again in a cleaner way so I can feel better about myself. Returning says, let me continue in the same process because the process is still the path. The first flatters vanity. The second builds strength. Choose the second more often, and your life will become much harder to derail. Now let us turn to the emotional cost of perfectionism in this stage. The perfectionist is often tired not from too much real work, but from too much inward resistance. He is constantly carrying the burden of his own ideal against his own current level. Every effort is heavy because it must survive not only the work itself, but the extra judgment, disappointment, and internal criticism he piles onto it. This makes the whole path feel more draining than it should. A wiser man lightens the burden at the point of entry. He says, this attempt is allowed to be rough. This week is allowed to be imperfect while still being useful. This phase is allowed to look small. Such allowances are not compromises with laziness. They are acts of sanity. They keep the work moving. And moving work almost always becomes better than frozen work. This is why productivity and self-mercy, rightly understood, are not enemies. A man who never grants himself room to be imperfect often becomes less productive, not more. He creates such a punishing atmosphere around effort that effort itself starts feeling dangerous. But the man who says, I will work seriously and I will let the first form be incomplete, keeps his hand freer. He can produce more. And because he produces more, he has more to refine, more to strengthen, more to learn from. That is a major advantage. Output is training. More honest output means more honest training. More honest training means more actual progress. Perfectionism reverses this and leaves a man overburdened with standards but undernourished with results. Now let us strike one more lie. Perfectionism says, if I cannot yet do it at the level I imagine, then perhaps I should not do it at all. This is nonsense. If a child cannot yet walk gracefully, should he stop walking? If a young builder cannot yet carve with mastery, should he abandon the craft? If a new businessman cannot yet judge with mature precision, should he never trade? No. Growth itself requires the rough stage, the clumsy stage, the uncertain stage, the stage where one effort is better than the last, not because each effort is beautiful, but because each effort adds one more correction, one more repetition, one more layer of strength. If you deny yourself this stage, you deny yourself the road to the thing you claim you want. So now the instruction becomes direct. In the middle, stay. Stay when the work still sounds rough. Stay when the improvement is real but not yet impressive. Stay when your standard keeps pulling you forward.